Welcome back to the Spoon Sports Podcast, a podcast examining current issues and topics in sports by exploring their history. At this time of year, some sports seasons are coming to a close and others are hitting their regular season stride. Let's get started with one sports season that ended recently, college football. Many important things off the field have happened, but before we get to that, we have to talk about the college football playoff semifinal games and the national championship. In the semifinal games, we really had two very different types of games. The first was Michigan and Alabama. The final on that one was 27-20 Michigan. Michigan was down 20-13 in the fourth quarter, but made a great comeback, and that game ended up going to overtime. Blake Corum and that run-heavy Michigan offense took the lead in overtime, and on the final play, Milroe got a low snap and tried to run the ball up the middle, but he couldn't, and Michigan won the game. Maybe the most important takeaway for Alabama in that game was their offensive line really struggled against that Michigan defensive line. The other playoff game was Texas versus Washington. Michael Penix had 430 yards and 2 touchdowns. It was tied 21-21 at halftime, but Washington scored 13 unanswered points to start the second half. Texas attempted a comeback, but they could not make it at the end, and Washington won that game 37-31. Now for the national championship, Michigan versus Washington. They dominated with a ground attack and their defense. Michigan picked apart Michael Penix and Washington, and they won 34-13. They pressured the Washington offense with 2 interceptions, a sack, and the Michigan defensive line held the Huskies to fewer total yards with 301 than Michigan tallied in rushing yards alone with 303. Penix only had 53% completion percentage and an efficiency rating of 93.6 with 255 yards. Blake Corum broke the Michigan rushing touchdown record in that game, and Donovan Edwards also had a big game on the ground with a 46-yard and 41-yard touchdown runs. Now for some off-the-field news, we can talk about the transfer portal. Ole Miss has dominated in the portal so far. They got Walter Nolan, the number 1 player in the 2022 class. Texas A&M has also been succeeding. Mike Oko, the new coach there, has been making moves. Florida State is another team that has done well in the portal in the past, and they have continued their success. Another team that's not very high in the rankings, but you could argue has done the most in the portal, is Ohio State. They got the number 1 player in the transfer portal, Caleb Downs. They got a great running back from Ole Miss, Krishan Judkins. And they got the number 1 quarterback in the 2024 class, Julian Sand from Alabama. Now, you might be thinking, why would the number 1 quarterback in the 2024 class be transferring from Alabama? Well, that is because maybe the biggest news so far has been Nick Saban's retirement. Alabama has suffered huge losses in recruiting in the transfer portal, like Julian Sand and Caleb Downs since his retirement. One of the biggest problems was, how are you going to replace Nick Saban? Who on earth could possibly replace Nick Saban and what he has done in Alabama? Many coaches around the country were said to be interested in the job, but Alabama decided to go with Kalen DeBoer from Washington. Nick Saban's retirement and DeBoer's hire in Alabama created a ripple effect throughout college football. Mike Norvell, who was said to be one of the favorites for that job, got a pay increase at Florida State. Steve Sarkisian, another favorite for Alabama, he also got a pay increase. And there were new hires at Washington and Arizona because of the movement of coaches. Another college sport, but this one is really hitting its stride, is college basketball. Because it's college basketball, there's almost too much to cover, too many upsets, so many teams losing. It's almost impossible to know all of it. UConn, I think, is universally the best team right now. Purdue and North Carolina are also very strong, but they have a few losses in games they probably should have won. Top 10 teams on the road have really struggled. Just the other night, TCU and Baylor went to overtime, and they had a great game, and Texas Tech upset Oklahoma. Now for the NFL, it's Super Bowl week. We're really coming to a close. The last couple weeks of the regular season and the playoffs really flew by. Some notes in the playoffs in the AFC was Houston destroying Cleveland and ending Joe Flacco's miracle run. Kansas City beat the Dolphins, who you could argue were kind of frauds the whole regular season anyway. Pittsburgh didn't stand a chance against Buffalo on the road. Lamar Jackson ended CJ Stroud's run, and they advanced to the AFC Championship. Mahomes beat Josh Allen again, and I think the thing you have to learn in the AFC is that don't bet against Patrick Mahomes. They beat Baltimore and move on to the Super Bowl. In the NFC, the Detroit Lions beat the Rams. Green Bay really blew out Dallas. The box score doesn't really show it in the end, but for most of the game, Green Bay dominated. You could say that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers upset the Philadelphia Eagles, but I think it's fair to say that most people expected that one. The San Francisco 49ers beat the Green Bay Packers and moved on to the championship, and the Lions beat Tampa Bay in the divisional round. In the NFC Championship, Detroit had the game in their hands. They were up 24-7, but San Francisco made a great comeback, and they will play the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl. Towards the end of the regular season, the NFC South came down to the wire. The Saints and the Falcons were still in it at the very end. The Eagles had an absolute meltdown down the stretch. They were 11-1 and finished the season 11-6, while also having the easiest schedule in the NFL in those last 5 or 6 games. On to the NBA, the Timberwolves have continued to keep their stride, and Anthony Edwards looks not only to be one of the best young players in the league, but maybe one of the best players in the league, period. The Celtics have stayed hot. In the East, the Bucks are still good, but they fired their head coach and have now hired Doc Rivers. They were 30-13 when they fired their head coach. Apparently revolved around some locker room problems. But honestly, if I'm 30-13, I'm not really thinking about firing my head coach, but we'll see how that works out for the Bucks. Early on, the Magic were one of the best teams in the East. They were 16-7, but they have really struggled since then. They've gone 7-15, and they've definitely fallen off. Pistons, they didn't win a game in November. They almost didn't win a game in December. They have continued their historic struggle. I'm not sure if they've been mathematically eliminated from the playoffs, but I think at this point, it doesn't matter. They're not making it. In the West, the Warriors are surprisingly really struggling. It's not just the team. Steph Curry has had kind of a rough stretch in their last couple of games. But a highlight in the West has been the Clippers. They have gone on a crazy surge. Since December 1st, they are 22-4. That is the best record in the NBA. And one thing in the last couple of nights that I'm not sure anyone could have seen coming was a number of historic scoring games for individual players. On the same night, Joel Embiid dropped 70 points, and Kat had 62. And then on the next night, Luka had 73 points. A couple nights later, Devin Booker had 62. And in both those games where Kat and Devin Booker had 62 points, both of their teams lost. Well, that concludes the current sports news. This week, I'll be discussing issues related to doping and equity in sport with an expert in this field, Dr. Thomas Hunt. He's the Associate Professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Education at the University of Texas at Austin. With research interests that include sport law, history, and international relations, Hunt has published articles in, among others, the Journal of Sport History, the International Journal of the History of Sport, and the International Journal of Sports Policy and Politics. His book, Drug Games, the International Olympic Committee and the Politics of Doping, 1960 to 2008, is considered a critical text on the topic. Now please enjoy this discussion with Professor Tommy Hunt. Okay, now I have here with me Professor Tommy Hunt. Thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
You've been publishing books and articles about doping in international sport for several decades, and obviously there are many issues we can address. But first, can you talk a little bit about how you became interested in researching this topic, and what were some of your early projects?
Yeah, so I came out of college. I'd been a government major, and then like a lot of government majors, I couldn't figure out, a job to go to that had a great ceiling. So I ended up going to law school. It was a difficult experience. I felt like I got a great legal education, especially a courtroom education. Met some great friends, but it was really difficult. And for a lot of it, I really didn't enjoy what I was doing. And I came out of law school, passed the bar exam, which was an adventure, and practiced law for a very brief amount of time at a boutique kind of plaintiff's firm. We had excellent trial lawyers, so I got involved and did some really interesting things. But overall, I was really unhappy, though. There are people who love practicing law. You can see it. I was not one of those people. And so I started looking around for, what else could I do with my life? And I ended up coming back to the University of Texas and did a PhD where I sort of specialized in the legal and political history of international sport. And I picked that topic because I wanted my legal education to still make sense to people when I was trying to explain myself, like, talking with you here. And if I could explore something I was really interested in, international sport and politics, and could do so through a legal lens, then at least it made law school make sense to people. And it ended up working out. I managed to get a job as a professor and love what I do. And I'm not sure I would have been able to do it without the legal education that I had. And so that's kind of where I came to
it. Just quickly, we might need to clarify our use of certain terms. I think of doping and steroids as pretty much one and the same, but are there any differences, and are there any terms we need to understand from the outset?
Sure. So steroids is one, well, it depends on how you frame it. So some steroids are used for very valid medical reasons. And in those sense, it's not doping to use them. When you are using them to dope, you're doing it to quote unquote artificially enhance your otherwise normal performance enhancement levels. And I would add that steroids are one type of doping when they're used in that format. There are other substances that you could use. Human growth hormone is another kind of classic example. And then I would add that there are non-pharmaceutical means of trying to enhance for performance. So you can take your own blood and put it through a centrifuge, concentrate the red blood cell count, put it back into your body through a transfusion, and that's not like a pharmaceutical intervention. It's your own blood, but it increases your oxygen carrying capacity for an amount of time, and it really works. And even outside of that, there are other things that I think there's a debate over what doping means. For example, I've had LASIK eye surgery, and a lot of really elite athletes have had LASIK eye surgery. You play baseball, and I know you're a really good baseball player. Your dad's a good baseball player. I've seen him golf. He's a really good golfer. And two of the most important things for both sports is eyesight. And if you look at Major League Baseball players, and if you look at Tiger Woods, they've had LASIK, and it's not just because they don't want to wear glasses. So I would add that there are other ways of doping besides pharmaceuticals, but I would also say doping is a really kind of difficult concept to truly define precisely. So what does it mean to artificially enhance? Your own red blood, is that artificially enhancing? Using human growth hormone, it's a hormone that's already in every human body, is using that. Doping, and if so, why and why not? Is using creatine to recover faster from a workout. Is that not doping, which most people don't consider it doping, compared to anabolic steroid use, which does many of the same things, maybe a different level, but kind of conceptually, doping, knowing what it is and what it isn't, in a really kind of ethically precise manner is slippery. And so I would add that as well.
Yeah, so now that we've at least tried to define the subject, we can talk about the history of doping now. For my listeners who might not be familiar with this topic, what are the origins of doping in sports, and when did it start to become an issue of concern?
Well, I suspect that it goes back almost as long as humans have been running around. I know in the ancient Greek Olympics, they would athletes would take or try to take certain substances, try to eat in a certain way in order to improve their performance levels. And then, of course, during the kind of the modern era, during the 1800s, people who were around such things noticed that stimulants could increase performance levels in some manner. They may not have exactly understood how it worked, but they understood there was a connection between stimulation and being able to perform better physically. Kind of the first sport where it really became a controversy was within horse racing, and it had nothing to do with kind of an ethical dimension to the actual performance of the animals. It had to do with whether you could count on a bet that you had waged. So it was gamblers who put up the first objections to substances turning up at a sporting event in a horse, and so they wanted to kind of create some sort of knowledge that what they could be betting on, they could be sure that it wasn't being influenced by some outside factor. I kind of stumbled over my words a little bit, but I hope you get the gist. Somewhere around the 30s, you see it popped up as an issue within the Olympic debates, on sort of a minor scale. So people were aware of it kind of in a loosely defined way. And then the Second World War, of course, had nothing to do with sports, but drugs were used on astonishing levels. So the German army, in many ways, was kind of marching on amphetamines, and Allied soldiers and sailors and Marines were using drugs as well on a different level, and of course we're using cigarettes on massive scales and coffee on massive scales to keep themselves going. And in the aftermath of the war, soldiers went home and they brought the knowledge of those things with them. And so you started seeing it, turn up in sports. In the 60s, kind of 1960 is where I think a real turning point happens. A a Danish cyclist named Knud Ehrenmark Jensen, and I'm sure I butchered that name. If you've ever tried to understand Danish, it is a difficult language. Anyway, he died in the time trials in, I believe it was in Rome. And the kind of rumor going around was he was on amphetamines, and that's what caused him to kind of pass out, fall, hit his head, and die. It's kind of interesting. The whole kind of modern anti-doping movement really is based on that one case. And there's a really brilliant, truly brilliant scholar named Werner Müller, who's in Denmark. He went and he found the actual autopsy records, and there were no traces of amphetamines found. And so we've kind of built this myth on the danger of doping. And I'm not saying there are no dangers, there certainly are, but we kind of built a huge myth about it being a truly death probability kind of thing to do, based on something that wasn't true. And so, but anyway, the 60s saw the first major kind of rules go in against doping. Of course, when you have rules put in place and you start to have testing, so one of the major worries of doing that, people always wonder, why did it take so long to develop tests and then to actually use them? Well, anytime you suspend an athlete or take a controversial decision, you run the risk of getting sued. And in the Olympic world, now we're talking billions upon billions of dollars as an industry, as a business, even though that it's nonprofit. Huge money is at stake, both for individual athletes and for the sporting organizations themselves. And you also, if you're a sporting organization, you run the risk of, man, if you really do something, are people going to turn away because either they think, what you're all of sport is unethical and based on sort of a lie as to who's better and who isn't, that the doctors are the real ones running the race. Either people are going to turn away for that reason, or we love to watch truly stupendous athletic feats. And if you stop having them at the rate we've become accustomed to, because athletes aren't using drugs, man, well, are you really willing to risk your declining media revenues? And so I think there were a lot of kind of forces weighing against really taking a stand against doping in sport, until it became just too big in the public eye to ignore it anymore. And so, you see from the 60s to where we are today with Russia's kind of suspension or repeated suspensions and everything that's going on there. And then, of course, you should know, and I know I'm skipping around a little bit here, but, the U.S. is very different. Our sports system is different. We don't kind of follow the anti-doping rules of the rest of the world. Our professional sports kind of aren't attached to the international sport world in the same way. And in the United States, drug policies in sport are really the result of collective bargaining agreements between the athletes and the organizations. And neither really truly wants to do something really truly meaningful, or they could hurt themselves. So so I'm not sure that was a full answer for you, but it's kind of where my mind went.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer. You mentioned some of the key turning points when doping was brought to international attention, and one of those times when it was a major issue was during the Cold War, when U.S. athletes squared off against Eastern Bloc athletes and anyone did whatever it took to win. Is it fair to say the U.S. was the victim in all this? And was it the Soviets and East Germans that were doing all the doping?
Certainly no. Although I'd say the way that doping was kind of handled was different. So doping in the Eastern Bloc, although it wasn't a true bloc, the Eastern Bloc countries didn't get along. Some liked each other more than others, but in any event, the Soviet and East German models, where it was very state controlled, it was very masterminded at the top. And they were very precise in which drugs were going to be used, how they were going to be used, when they were going to be used, how much we're going to be used, and athletes. Some athletes didn't have a choice. Some weren't even informed what they were being given. Young gymnasts in East Germany, for example, were given a little blue pill, and they were told those are your vitamins for the day. Well, it turned out to be oral turinabol, a type of anabolic steroid. They didn't have informed consent in the way that we require in the West. And so in a sense, they were victims. Of course, there were other athletes in the Eastern Bloc that wanted to win, that all they cared about is winning, just like many of our athletes in the West. And they were willing participants in using drugs. And so there's a lot of gray area, I think, when it comes to the Eastern Bloc. And there's some interesting kind of ethical questions that are interesting and we're talking about in an historical sense. But before we go into those, in the Western world, in the United States, doping kind of evolved differently. It wasn't top down. The officials at the top weren't actively pushing or requiring U.S. athletes to take anything. Sometimes they turned a blind eye to it very willingly. But in large part, it was the athletes themselves, in combination with their coaches and athletic trainers, kind of individually or in small groups going out and finding drugs to use. And in some cases in the U.S., which was much more restricted, or at least officially restricted than in the Soviet Union, when you're going out to try and find stuff on your own, many times you turn to the black market, and we're seeing it now with fentanyl, where you're getting a lot of tainted stuff. And so, which is more dangerous, what was happening in the Soviet Union and East Germany, or what was happening in the United States? I think there's a really interesting debate. But nevertheless, here it was mostly the athletes on their own who were going out and doping, whereas on the other side, it was the people at the top who were pushing it down. So I think, the victim, neither side was a victim. I think some individuals were victims, but both sides didn't handle it exactly right. I think both are culpable in their own senses. I don't think one is, the victim over another. It was really, sport became, sport has always been unpure. And so I'm not sure what to say about kind of the victim question. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm glad you asked it, but I think it's a lot fuzzier than most people like to think.
Yeah. In one of your previous answers to the questions, you talked about some of the problems with some of the earlier drug tests, but how successful were the efforts to test and prevent doping? And are there any landmarks in that effort that we should mention?
So 68 was the first drug test. They were only for amphetamines. And it took a long time to develop kind of the scientific knowledge to detect certain things in the human body. And even today, the system is far from perfect. If you change a small bit of the chemistry of a particular thing, it no longer shows up in a test result, even though it does pretty much the same thing that its precursor did that you can detect. The most famous recent case in that we've seen is Russia, of course, and most of the Russian teams were using drugs, and very few of them were very few were ever testing positive. And the reason was they were very smart about the tests and finding ways to get around them. And so I would say even today that if people believe that you can rely on the testing system, it's not true. Most of times when actions have been successful against athletes who are doping, it's because of an informant, gave them up, or some other investigative technique. It's not the testing.
Let me ask you a broad question about the history of various doping scandals, and you could take it whichever direction you would like. There have been several major doping scandals that really rocked the sports world. Ben Johnson at the 1988 Seoul Olympics, Lance Armstrong in the Tour de France, Major League Baseball and Balco, with Mark McGwire, Barry Bonds, and a bunch of other players. And finally, like you mentioned, the rushing doping scandal of the last decade or so, which was featured in the documentary Icarus. Let me just ask if there are any highlights that you want to talk about or any common themes and lessons we can learn from them collectively.
I think, one of the common themes is something that I just mentioned, is that testing and the official drug protocols didn't really catch very many people. The Ben Johnson case is one of the few exceptions. The way in which he was using drugs, it wasn't systematized in the same way that the Eastern Bloc was able to time things to where, the substance was out of your system by the time you had to take a test. And so, that's the one major exception, and it was a big deal. And it was a major spark in the creation of the World Anti-Doping Agency. I know I'm losing track of what your actual question is. I'll find my way back to it. I think the common theme for most of them is that it's been legal investigations and not tests that have been successful in bringing action against athletes and catching athletes. I would also say that, kind of looking back, it's shocking the degree that people were surprised. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see the types of huge performance leaps in each of those kind of situations, and not just suspect, but really know what was going on. Looking back, how could people not know? And so I think another surprising aspect, and this is true of myself as well, we are, as spectators, I'm a spectator and fan of sport, in addition to being what I hope is a decent scholar, a neutral scholar about sport. And it's really interesting to see how we willingly kind of put blinders on ourselves when watching sport as to really what's going on. And so I think that's one of the really interesting things to have gone through, both watching other people and thinking about myself. I used to really be a purist about sport. If you read my first book, it really takes kind of a black and white, good and evil sort of approach. I think it's a good book, and I'm very, very proud of it. At the same time, I think, now I'm 45, I'm older. I think I have more understanding and sympathy or empathy for people. I think I would handle the book in a different way if I were writing it now. And in fact, I would say kind of the second stage of my career, part of it has been correcting what I think are unfairnesses about my kind of the first stage of my career in looking at doping. And so I'd say I've matured in how I think about it and how I look at it. And one sad part about it personally for me is that I am much less a fan of sport than I used to be. I don't watch nearly as much just because I don't enjoy it as much. I know too much about it. Your dad has probably been through some of those same experiences. I am addicted to American football, addicted, even though I want to stop. I try for over 10 years, I tried not to watch football in front of my kids because I didn't want them to play football. We know too much about it now. Some of that is about drugs that are used. More of it is about the head trauma that we see as the reasons I never wanted them to play. But going back to it, I know too much now to be the same type of fan that I used to be. And I think a lot of people are starting to have that kind of feeling.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned about fans really having blinders on and not willing to accept what was really happening, I was thinking a very similar thing, specifically about, I think it was the 1998 home run race with Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, and it's just this incredibly historical, never been before, and it was so obviously because of some of the things that you mentioned. But do you think fans were just, I guess, unwilling to really think about what was really going on because they were so, I guess, just involved and in love with what was happening?
I think people need heroes. I need heroes. Many people find them in sports. There are other heroes out there. And but we grew up in a sporting culture, and I think it's still there, but especially your dad and I in our generation. Many of our heroes came from the sporting world, and we wanted to be athletes. All I wanted to be was to be a quarterback for the Houston Oilers. And most people don't get their exact dreams in life, but I think we grew up in an age of sporting heroes, and yeah, I think it was kind of being in love with sports that causes you to miss the flaws. In the same way, should not bring this up. Maybe we shouldn't put this on the podcast, but when you're young and in love, you sometimes miss the things that you might want to think about before you get into a lifetime marriage. And so I think the same with sports. It's hard to think rationally about something you're in love with.
I think that's perfectly able to be in the podcast. I don't see any problem with that. Anyway, I think we've covered a lot of the historical aspects. So for the last few minutes, we can get into some of the ethical questions, and maybe your legal background can come into play here. Isn't it tempting to say, okay, if people want to use steroids to improve their performance, just let them do it? If everybody's on the same playing field, does it really matter? So how do we handle that question?
Yeah, I think that's it's another. There's no perfect answer here. There's no real. I mean, there are right and wrong answers in my head. I have a certain way of looking at the world. Everybody has their own ethical code, and I've got one inherited largely from my grandfather. I spent 3 months of every summer and 1 month of the winter break solely with my grandfather, and I inherited many of his moral outlooks on life. And so I would say that we can't just let it be a free for all for a couple of reasons. First, I do think that sometimes people need to be protected from themselves, and that a moral obligation is owed to individuals to try and come up with or kind of put a framework that helps there to be some safety boundaries. In the same way that we don't allow people to drive 200 miles an hour on a neighborhood street. I think if a true free for all took place, it could be dangerous. People are really willing to try unbelievable things at astonishing levels. There was a study looking at drug use in a gym that really opened my eyes. People were taking like 20 different types of anabolic steroids at 10 each at like 10 times the dosage that would be quote unquote level at the same time. I mean, that's crazy. And if people and there was a significant number of people using it in just one gym. So I think there is a health risk that I think you can't just have a free for all. And I'd also say that allowing everybody to use whatever does not mean everybody would have the same access. An athlete in Ghana isn't going to have the same access to anything compared to an athlete in Los Angeles. And so I think there's kind of a myth in the logic there, where and the same is true in the United States. Somebody who is in a low socioeconomic group isn't going to have the same type of access as somebody who's in a different socioeconomic group. So a level playing field, I don't think you're going to get there with a free for all. But it's really the safety aspect that is scary. We've seen fentanyl run rampant, and it's killing kids. And I don't know if a free for all in doping would have the same kind of. Fentanyl is so potent at a very rapid pace. I don't know if it would be on that level of danger, but it wouldn't be a good thing, I don't think.
Well, obviously, your answer to that question just proves how much answering that question is a challenge. Another challenge is, what do we do with all the accomplishments?
That was a backhanded compliment, but I'll I understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Another challenge is what we do with all the accomplishments that were done with the benefit of steroids or doping. We mentioned some of them earlier. Lance Armstrong's unbelievable races in the Tour de France, world records in sprinting, home run records. These things happened. We witnessed them. But many of the records are deleted from the record books or with an asterisk. So how do you think we should handle these kinds of things?
Man, I don't have a clue. I don't have a clue. And, it's not something I think about a lot. So I don't know. Again, I don't think there is a perfect answer. There just isn't. I think if this is going to be, it's going to sound kind of like passing the buck or not giving you an answer. But I think the real problem is our love of sports. Rather than, do we need a Hall of Fame for how many balls you can hit over a fence? Is it that important? I think we've just culturally ascribed so much importance to sport that that I think even the fact that we ask the question, and it's a good question, but even the fact that we as a culture care so much about who's in the Hall of Fame or not is kind of damning about ourselves in the general sense that, man, to even have a Hall of Fame for throwing a ball, is it that important, and is it worth it? And or would our time be better spent throwing a ball with our kids? That is not a good answer, I don't think, for what you're looking for. But I think it has to do with I'm just kind of tired of a big time sports because I've fallen out of love with it. And I think that has played a role in how I look at it as a scholar.
I think that's a perfectly capable answer to that question, just because the psychological aspect that you mentioned is a very big part of it. And now we can shift gears to your latest project. You've mentioned to me in advance of this interview that your latest research involves performance enhancement in the military. This is all new to me, so let me just invite you to tell us about it.
Yeah, so the larger book is about the changing nature of combat physicality. So in the past, physicality on the battlefield has largely been thought of in terms of strength and speed and endurance. And in today's technologically driven digital world, what's needed on the battlefield is very different kind of than the physicality that was needed in World War II, in Vietnam. And so so a coder today is worth, I couldn't quantify it, but many times more than a single infantryman to the military. And so we have sort of what I think is a changing nature as to what's needed in a modern military. And part of what I'm looking at in that kind of broader book project is the ways by which militaries have tried to enhance performance and what makes sense and what doesn't, what may be ethical, what isn't. And so looking at things like sleep deprivation, loss of sleep is a huge physical and cognitive performance decreaser. And so the militaries have tried to find ways around that. Modafinil, for example, is a drug that keeps you awake and relatively clear-minded for longer. Amphetamines are another thing that are given to long-duration military air crews so that they can stay awake long, for 15 hours in a fighter cockpit, and so that they can perform their mission. So so I'm looking at that as where things are going in the future. Genetic manipulation is now possible, and militaries are interested in doing that. And it may not happen overnight, but they're thinking about it in the medium to far future. And it's some really, man, if we think the ethics are complicated now, the ethics of genetic manipulation, changing the very core of a human being, things are going to get wild and fascinating very quickly. And so it's a fascinating period of change. So that's what the book is about. And of course, women play a large role in what I'm looking at. Women make up 16% of the US military. Well, they're over 50% of the US population. Most Americans can't get into the military who are of the primary military age, 18 to 26. And it's because of our increasing obesity levels. People just physically cannot meet the standards required for military entrance. And so a question, becomes, are there performance enhancing things that can be done that can boost those levels? And I would also say the biggest group that is relatively underutilized right now is women. They just by sheer numbers are the fastest way to make up our gap in military entrance requirements. And so if you look at performance enhancement in the broader sense, women have really been handicapped in the military because everything has been designed physically for men. Fighter cockpits are designed for men. If a woman ejected in how ejection seats were initially designed, it would have decapitated them, most women. And so you see sort of equipment designs that should be changed for performance enhancing reasons for women. The body armor that women wore during the global war on terror, it didn't fit correctly, and it made them much more susceptible to blast injuries. And so, if you need to dramatically increase the percentage of women in the military, you need to redesign equipment so that it works for them. So I think that is a performance enhancement kind of effort. It may be different than anabolic steroids, but it is a performance enhancement effort that is gonna have to happen in many senses in the military. So that's kind of the broad sketches of what I'm looking at now.
You mentioned the possibility that if military performance enhancement continues to grow, that there would be some big ethical concerns. Is there any ethical controversy about it now?
Yeah, there is. There have been questions about anabolic steroid applications in U.S. Special Forces, for example. There for a long time there wasn't randomized drug testing for Navy SEALs, and now there is, because their kind of basic training, underwater demolition SEAL training, was so difficult that their recruits the people who were trying to undergo it were turning to anabolic steroids. And there were, those run health risks that could, be really dangerous. There have been SEALs who have died in that kind of training phase. And so questions about whether drugs could have played a role or not, I think those are valid questions. And in most senses, the U.S. military is very much against illicit drug use, I'll put it that way, for performance enhancing reasons. But when we talk about special operations forces, they are thinking about it, whether the benefits outweigh the risks, and maybe they do. But at the same time, we have to think about, do special forces personnel, should they have informed consent? Should they have the right to say no? Do you have to tell them, all the long-term risks that might be taken? Do you need to tell them that the short-term risks? There's a case of a top gun graduate who, once he got out of the Navy, went to the Air National Guard and was flying for the Air National Guard, and was overseas in combat operations, was on a 15-hour flight. And he and his wingman on the same flight, they were taking amphetamines, and they mistakenly identified a group of Canadian troops as being the enemy, and dropped weapons on them and killed a number of Canadian personnel. And it was brought up, charges were brought up against him. And the defense was that, they gave me amphetamines to keep me awake for 15 hours, and they knew there were risks, and they didn't tell me all the risks. And and that was wrong, and that caused me to make the mistake. Figuring out what's true and what's not true, and whether the drugs were the proximate cause of the the tragedy. It's hard to figure out, but nevertheless, there is definitely debate, and will be increasing debate about these things in the military going forward.
Yeah, one ethical question that could be very interesting here as well is with sports, we have to make sure that the playing field is fair for all competitors, or at least we try. But in war, we don't have to be concerned with fairness. In fact, most countries or militaries would probably say it's better if they have an unfair advantage. So how do the soldiers think about their own performance enhancement within the military?
Yeah, I think it varies by context. I think on an individual basis, at least what I've seen so far is that they just want to make it into the unit. They just want to pass, and so they turn to drugs, thinking that will give them an advantage to make it to the end of the training. And in some cases, maybe it does, but I think largely they're not thinking about whether they have an advantage over the enemy. They do have an advantage over the enemy. For the last 20 years, combat operations against terrorist groups and the Iraqi and Afghani armies and insurgents, look at the weaponry and vehicles we bring to the table. It's like an army from Mars against an army from 1920. So I don't think they're in most cases thinking about it. Do I have an advantage over the enemy? Yes, they do. I do think there are small kind of scale things where maybe at the really elite levels, doing really specific types of missions, maybe they think about it, like amphetamine use in small airplanes on long duration operations. So I'm not sure if that answered the question. I will say they'll be thinking about it differently when it comes to, rivalries with China over the next 15 years.
Yeah, I think that was a really good answer to the question. And I think it brought it back to your original point about how the landscape of militaries has changed so much since, both of the world wars and times similar to that, where it's not about necessarily the numbers and the size of the people in the military. It's more about like the capability of the technology and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, now for my last question. In all of my episodes, I focused on the history of various issues in sports. But as a final question, I ask each of my guests to think about the present and the future. So where would you say we are on doping compared to where we have been in the past? And what issues do you see being important as we move ahead into the future over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I would say that that's a difficult question, man. So where are we now? I think we're still in love with sports, and we're not as blind. I don't think your generation is not as in love as I think your dad and our generation was, or maybe you're in love in a different way. But I think kids are in many numbers, or in large numbers, turning against traditional sports. To what degree doping or not has played a role in that, I'm not entirely sure. I think there are other kind of generational cultural issues going on. But I do think that one wonders where the sporting world is going, say in 30 years. Will it exist? Everything is constantly evolving, everything. But I'm not sure that today's sporting environment is sustainable. Is college sports sustainable in our current society over a 30-year time horizon? I don't know. So I think also just the medical possibilities, the pharmaceutical knowledge and non-pharmaceutical scientific knowledge that exists now, it is radically different, and it is radically expanding. And so what's possible in doping is going to be much more, is going to be much bigger than anything we've seen in the past. And so I think dealing with those kind of monumental possibilities that are going to be scientifically possible, I think those are going to be the really kind of crucial things over the next decades. And I don't know where it's going to go. Are we going to become more accepting of it? Because we certainly are, even beyond sports. So doping exists in the non-sporting world. You see stock market traders taking amphetamines to stay focused and up longer, to do their jobs and outperform their competitors. I'm sure some of your students in your classes are taking amphetamines, like Adderall. Some, in many cases, with a prescription, in other cases without a prescription. But we become kind of a performance enhanced society, and to what degree, I think sport has mirrored that, and we've seen it as kind of a pure space in our world. And I think we also have to look at ourselves, those of us who are not involved in sport, and see the degree to which performance enhancement is affecting our world as well. So it's going to be a really fascinating future for the subject.
Well, that's all the questions I have. Tommy, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining me.
Absolutely. Happy to be here, and it's great to be part of such an interesting project. You're a great interviewer.
Well, that is it for this episode of the Spoon Sports Podcast. I want to say thank you to Tommy Hunt for joining me for this interview. And of course, I also wanted to say thank you to Aslan Handavanji, my mentor, for helping me along the way. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to another episode in the future.